Welcome to Burning into the Abyss, the podcast where the art of wood burning meets the darkest corners of curiosity. I'm your host, and in each episode we'll explore the macabre while creating beautiful pieces of pyrography artwork. As wood meets flame and images emerge from the smoke, cinder, and ash, we'll discuss terrifying true crimes, a little bit of the paranormal, and some episodes we're going to call story time. Whether you're an artist, a spooky enthusiast, or just looking to drown out the insufferable silence, you're in the right place. So grab some snacks, settle in, and let's turn up the heat. This is Burning into the Abyss. Let's get started.
Let the dark keep my name.
Hey everybody, welcome to the very first episode of Burning into the Abyss. I appreciate you joining, whether it was for the art or the storytelling, or just because you needed to put something on to fall asleep. I'm glad you're here with us. Now, I say something to fall asleep to, not because I intend to be boring, but because I've been told by several reputable sources that my voice has the uncanny ability to put people to sleep quite efficiently. So if you have to watch this in parts, I completely understand that. It's not the greatest superpower to have, but it is mine, and I'm going to own up to it. I only found it fitting that our first episode covered a true crime case that I grew up hearing stories about throughout my entire childhood. And to explain that a little bit more, I actually grew up in central Wisconsin, about 15 minutes outside of a town called Plainfield. Now, as soon as I say Plainfield, I know that all of you immediately know exactly what I'm talking about because of this Netflix special that's come out. And if you didn't watch the Netflix special and true crime isn't your thing, then buckle up, because this one's a doozy. Growing up outside of Plainfield, I heard stories around campfires that as a child I just believed were stories. I did not think that they were actual occurrences, actual events, or crimes that were committed by an actual person. It just seemed so unreal and so fantastic that I just couldn't believe it. As I got older, of course, I found out that it was true. And even older, when I went into college after high school and I was going for law enforcement and I was in an abnormal psychology class, a criminal psychology class. And being that we were in the state of Wisconsin, of course, the prime case study for that class, none other than Ed Gein. To study that case from a psychological aspect pulled me in. And it was fascinating to me because it encompassed so many different things, not only environmental causes for his behavior, but then there was the post-passing of his mother, what that did to him psychologically, and what that could have pushed him to do beyond that. Now, there are some instances, because a lot of people say that it was after his mother passed that he started his crimes, but we're going to discuss some things that may or may not have happened. You know, they were never proven but never disproven, that occurred prior to Augusta's passing. So, like all good stories, we have to start this one at the beginning, so we're going to take it back to kind of take a look at Ed Gein's childhood, his family environment, his home environment, kind of where he grew up. Being that I'm from the area, I have a little bit of insight into the town of Plainfield. I did spend quite a bit of time there. I ended up moving back there as an adult after I had children, and I used to take my kids trick-or-treating right on Main Street in Plainfield. Like all stories, we're going to start at the beginning. And for this one, we start off in La Crosse, Wisconsin on August 27th of 1906, Ed's birthday. So he was born to his father, George, and his mother, Augusta. And at that time, they had already had an older son named Henry. Now, George was a lot of things when they were living in La Crosse. Okay, he was a firefighter, he was a carpenter. He even owned a local grocery store for a while, but then he sold the business and moved the family out to a 150-acre farm in the town of Plainfield. And that is where Ed would, of course, gain his notoriety later in life, but where the family would live out the rest of their days. Now, being a store owner and a firefighter and carpenter, that's what he did. What George was known for was being a violent alcoholic, who would regularly beat his children, both of them, both Ed and Henry. And Ed would say later on in life, during one of the many, many interviews, that his father would hit him in the head so hard that his ears would start to ring. So you can imagine the impact that would have on development as he grew up. That's not even the worst abuse that I'm going to say Ed suffered, because we're going to get into Augusta a little bit. Now, Augusta didn't like living in the city because of her views on life. Augusta was very fanatically religious. And when I say fanatically, I mean fire and brimstone fanatical. And she really took advantage of their time on the farm in Plainfield, being able to keep her sons away from the evils of the world, as she put it. Now, the evils of the world to Augusta Gein were just about everything was evil. You guys seen that movie Waterboy? Yeah. Well, I think that's where they got the character from, was Augusta Gein, Bobby Boucher's mom. So Augusta basically would isolate both Ed and Henry as much as she could. Ed kind of clung a little bit closer to her, and a lot of that had to do with the abuse that he suffered from his father. Now, in doing so, he believed everything that Augusta said to be absolute truth. There was no questioning it. And any thoughts or notions or feelings or sensations that he had outside of what she told him was the absolute truth. It made him feel bad. It made him feel guilty. He actually felt guilt for thinking impure thoughts, or, for kind of going against anything that Augusta had told him when he was growing up. Now, Ed did attend school, and he was actually a pretty good student, especially when it came to reading. Ed was a big reader. Okay, now, when he was at home, it was kind of restricted to the Bible. But outside of that, Ed would find other things to read. And I know there was something I was reading where, people thought that Ed was simple to the point where he was illiterate. And that's just not true. He was actually a very developed reader, and he read quite a bit, which is going to bring up some very interesting things when we learn about his crimes later on in life. But as a child, he was very good in school. Now, that's academically. Socially, he was very awkward. He was very shy. He would have a lot of strange tics and movements, random bouts of laughter when it was inappropriate or unwarranted even. And these are just things that people noticed about him early on. Now, again, he may have been developmentally challenged at a very young age. We're talking about the early 1900s here, when a lot of this wasn't really, being studied and diagnosed. So there may have been some cognitive issues there, but being isolated and abused the way that he was, and just living with Augusta on a day-to-day basis, that's going to take a toll on you mentally and psychologically. Regardless, though, Ed stuck close to her. He was right at her heels. Her word was absolute, and that was it. Try to avoid George, because you're probably going to get smacked around a little bit. A lot of bit. During their time in Plainfield, there were some incidences that happened that, we don't really know a whole lot about. What we do know is that on April 1st of 1940, George did pass away. The cause of death was heart failure. He was 66 years old. And that left Henry and Ed with a big responsibility running the farm because Augusta wasn't accustomed to doing so. Now, that's not to say that she couldn't handle the animals and things like that, because she did. But George was gone, and George was the provider. He was the father. And that's just how they viewed it at that time. Now, Henry was a little bit of a different story here, because Henry wasn't aligning with Ed and Augusta. He wasn't falling into that same trap. Henry wanted to be educated. He wanted to experience the world and experience life outside of Augusta's narrow view. And there was a time where he was seeing a woman, a divorcee with 2 children, and he was actually planning on moving in with her. And this is where the Ed Gein lore kind of gets maybe not. So in private conversations, Henry is trying to convince Ed to separate himself from Augusta. He's trying to tell him that there is a whole world out there that he needs to experience, and that being trapped there with her is only hurting him, and it's only detrimental to him. So he was trying to help his little brother, is what Henry was doing. Now, to Ed, he saw that as, you're going against our mother, and you're sinning, you're evil, you shouldn't be with this girl who has, by Augusta's own admission, she believed that this girl that Henry was falling in love with was somebody that was sinned, and that she was evil. Henry didn't want to believe that, because he was a sane and rational person and believed that people are allowed to live their lives to a certain degree. So Henry was trying to get Ed to see that. Now, one day, 1944, early May, I don't remember the exact date, but I do remember reading about it. Ed and Henry were out, and they were using a controlled burn technique to kind of clear off some brush off of the property. It got out of control. It got windy. Central Wisconsin, around the Plainfield area, Waushara County area, it's sand country. There's a lot of dry, dead grass. Fire spreads quickly. I know firefighters that dreaded the summer season because they were busy, and it was nonstop, and it got out of control fast. So there was an incident early May of 1944 where Ed and his brother were trying to clear some of the brush out. Fire got out of control. They couldn't contain it. That's where the story gets a little fuzzy. Okay. So Ed had to run out, tell people that the fire was out of control. This is the 50s, okay? So there's no cell phones, or I'm sorry, the 40s. So there's no cell phones, nothing like that. Ed had to run out. It took a while for the fire department to get out there because of where they were. They weren't too far out of town, but they were far enough out of town. So they get out there, they put out the fire. Ed doesn't know what happened to Henry. Okay. So then they go out, they start looking for Henry. It was weird, and it drew suspicion later on because Ed was able to, despite saying he wasn't sure where Henry was, he lost sight of him in the smoke and in the flames, and they got separated. It didn't take them long to find Henry because Ed led them right to him. Okay, so cause of death was asphyxiation. That's what the official coroner report is. They said that there was no possible foul play or anything like that. He died from smoke inhalation, and that's what it was. However, there was bruising on the side of Henry's head. Now, they took Ed at his word at that time and just Yeah, it's fire got out of control. You were trying to get out. You lost your brother. He succumbed to the smoke and flames. Police at that time accepted Ed's explanation as it was, and that was it. Henry was gone. So now George and Henry are both gone, and that leaves Ed alone with Augusta. That is where things kind of start to really, really spiral. And Ed kind of feels this unhealthy attachment to Augusta, and it's noticeable. Now, after Henry passes away, Augusta actually ends up suffering a stroke, and it's quite debilitating. And it's shortly after Henry passes away. Okay, and this is when Ed kicks in his mother obsession. He is obsessively caring for his mother at this point. Okay, so somewhere around mid 1944, Ed is left to care for his mother and the farm completely by himself. In December of 1945, Ed Gein suffers the greatest tragedy of his life. His mother passes away. It was not only his best friend, it was not only his mother. Augusta had become his entire world. After George and Henry were gone and she had her stroke, that was it for him. He was at home caring for mother. He was working the farm and caring for her the best that he could. Once she passed away, Ed just had himself, his thoughts. But he was free to think. For the first time in his life, he was free to think thoughts that were his own. He was free to feel feelings that were his own. I think before we move on to how Augusta's death affected Ed, we need to touch real quick on the whole Henry situation. So, Ed was never charged in Henry's death. It was ruled by a medical examiner as accidental death from asphyxiation, smoke inhalation. However, he had bruising on his head. The events that led up to the fire right before when Henry passed would have led, based on what we know about Ed now, could have led to Ed lashing out against Henry. Perhaps there was some discussion while they were out there. Ed saw it as the perfect opportunity. I don't know if he would have been cognizant to put those two things together, but who knows? The thing that makes me suspect that Ed, and not just me, but a lot of other people suspect that Ed had murdered Henry, was the fact that Ed and Henry were very, very isolated by Augusta. George was in and out of the family life. It wasn't really a permanent fixture, to be honest with you. So Ed and Henry were left with Augusta all the time, and they both kind of saw her in different lights. While Ed saw his mother as the absolute truth, Henry viewed her more as the controlling, religious fanatic that he had grown up with his whole life. We do know that before Henry passed, he was planning on moving away from the Gein farm and moving in with a woman and her two children. He was also at that time trying to get Ed to see that the relationship that he had with his mother and what was going on in their home was not normal. It was not healthy, and it was not natural. Ed didn't like that. Ed saw it more as Henry going against Augusta. And knowing how Ed felt about Augusta, we know that that wouldn't have made him very happy. So did Ed murder Henry? Maybe. I'd say it's a good possibility. Ed may have seen Henry leaving as a situation that would be created that he would not be able to manage. Or he may have seen how Henry upset Augusta, and it could have made him want to eliminate Henry to make him feel like he was doing something for Augusta to make her happier. While none of this was ever actually proven or documented, I feel that it stands as a strong possibility as to what happened to Henry and how it happened. I mean, if you put Ed Gein in a stressful, dangerous situation with any other human being, do you really think that Ed Gein's going to be the one walking out of that? If there was no foul play, I don't think so. I don't see that happening. I see him going into panic mode well before Henry, and I don't see Henry falling down, hitting his head on several rocks. It's just me. All right, so Henry's gone, George is gone, Augusta has now passed, and that leaves Ed by himself. Now, as to exactly when Ed started digging up graves, there's not like a date. He didn't keep a record or anything like that. He did have a very good memory of who he dug up, when he dug them up. One of the biggest rumors we're going to dispel right away is that Ed Gein did not dig up his own mother. He couldn't dig up his own mother. Her coffin was actually encased in concrete, so there was no way for him to get to him. Now, that's not to say that he didn't try, because there are several accounts that verify that he did try to dig up Augusta's grave. He just couldn't. He couldn't get to her. So it is confirmed that he did dig up one of the graves that is very close by to where Augusta and George and Henry and himself are buried. And I've been to the Plainfield Cemetery. I have stood where the Gein family is buried. It's a very strange thing to see, just because Ed does not have a headstone. The reason why Ed doesn't have a headstone is because it had been stolen so many times. So eventually, between the theft and vandalism, the local sheriff's department, Washera County Sheriff's Department, actually took the headstone from the cemetery. There's just a small patch of sand that will never grow grass over it, because there are people out there that make the trek to Plainfield, Wisconsin, and they collect dirt and sand from Ed Gein's grave. The other graves that he disturbed, I know that the names have been released, and there is a list online, and people will go and photograph those sites as well. I have toured the entire cemetery, and it's a very small, well-kept cemetery. There's still a lot of flowers that are left by graves and things like that. People still frequent the cemetery. It's not like some, remote, out-of-the-way cemetery. It's just off of a major highway that runs between Plainfield and Stevens Point, I guess would be the next biggest town. Runs right through Wapaka as well. So Ed Gein started robbing graves because of an obsession of his. So with Augusta gone, Ed was able to kind of start to read and indulge his mind in areas that she would have deemed otherwise evil. So he didn't do that when she was still alive. However, after she passed, he was able to kind of read what he wanted to and think about things that he wanted to and fantasize about things that he wanted to. And a lot of those things were dark and grotesque at times. A big thing he was interested in was head shrinkers. So that was something that he read a lot about, studied a lot about, and even attempted to do himself. Admittedly, that was something that came across in an interview, which again has now been published to YouTube, some of those tapes that have been recovered from the Washera County Sheriff's Office and made public record. Now, when it comes to robbing graves, he was most active between 1947 and 1952. Those were the times that he was frequently going to the cemetery. And I've read everywhere from 9 incidences all the way up to 40. Now, he admitted to nine that he could remember, that he took the sheriff's department to the cemetery, showed them the graves, pointed them out. Some of them were even excavated. And in one of the coffins, they found some bones, but they also found Ed Gein's crowbar. So they knew that he was telling the truth. The reason why they made him do that was simply because they had a hard time believing that somebody of Ed Gein's size and stature in a single night could not only dig up a grave, but take body parts, get the body out of the hole itself, out of the casket. And for someone of his size and age and physical makeup to be able to do that just seemed beyond the realm of belief. And Ed admitted that it was not easy. So I think that the fact that he was able to do this continuously, one, it shows his determination and fascination. But two, it also shows a certain level of depravity that kind of goes beyond what we might normally conceive as being dark and twisted. Throughout his, we'll say, grave robbing incidences, Ed began to collect certain pieces. He did attempt to build a female bodysuit. You hear the stories about the lampshades and furniture coverings and bowls made from human skulls and things like that. You would have thought that he would have murdered, hundreds of people based on what they found in his house. In reality, he was just collecting these pieces from various grave sites. There was a couple of times that Ed did admit where he would get down to the coffin, and actually it's not what it seems. So a coffin is not buried as a coffin, at least not in Plainfield it isn't. It is put in a wooden crate, and then the wooden crate is then buried. So he would have to dig down to the wooden crate and then get through the crate to get to the actual coffin. And there were times where he would get all the way down to that crate and he would open the crate, pry up a couple of the boards. That's why he had the pry bar. And for whatever reason, and he couldn't explain it. I don't think he ever did explain it, but he said it would just hit him and he would realize like what he was doing was wrong. And it was disturbing, and it bothered him enough to where he would carefully and respectfully fill the open grave back in, and he would just leave. He wouldn't take anything. He wouldn't open the coffin. He would just leave. So hearing him say that kind of almost makes you think like there's some level of consciousness that like, hey, this is just wrong. Like I shouldn't be doing this, but it didn't stop him from doing it. Now, the way that I'm going to cover this crime portion of Ed's life is in two different parts, because much like many other infamous killers, serial killers, we don't know the complete depths and we don't know the span of the crimes, simply because there's not sufficient evidence to tie them to other crimes, but there are other crimes that share a resemblance to the ones that we know of, the ones that are definitive and the ones that we can say, yes, Ed Gein committed these crimes. Of course, the two most notable were the murders that he committed. So Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. There was also other crimes that were committed around that area that even the sheriff's department has on record that they did look into Ed Gein as a potential suspect after everything else came out about his own crimes. They thought, okay, maybe because this one is unsolved. However, they still remain unsolved. So it makes it hard to definitively say, yeah, it was definitely Ed Gein that did this, or it was definitely Ed Gein that did this. We may never know. So first, I'm going to cover the definitive, yes, he did this. and then we'll go into the speculative. Maybe he did this, you know. So when Ed was digging up graves, he was taking body parts. He did not engage in cannibalism with the dead bodies because Ed was well enough aware that consuming flesh that had been embalmed would make him sick. So the cannibalism aspect of it did not come in until after he committed his first murder. However, when they went through his house when he was arrested and they actually started to go through and peel back the layers of the house, if you've ever seen the crime scene photos, you know that it would take a concentrated effort to find certain things within his house. He was not a housekeeper at all. Once Augusta passed, that house fell apart real fast. He didn't throw out trash. He didn't make regular trips to the dump, to the, I guess, was it landfill? Like he didn't do any of that. He didn't clean up after himself. There was dirty dishes and there was garbage everywhere. And he attempted to cook a human heart. He tried to do that. They found it in a pot on his stove after he was arrested. And instead of realizing like, wow, this is quite the task, he just left it there. Like he didn't discard it or do anything else with it. He just left it on the stove and it was just sitting there rotting. That's one of the things that I think says a lot about what Ed was reading about. Something that I remember when I was deep into my 4 or 5 year span of Ripperology with Jack the Ripper was the Mary Kelly killing, and something that really stuck out in my mind at that time was that the killer had actually put her heart into a pot over the fireplace, or rather in the fireplace. So was that something that Ed had read about? You know, did he glorify Jack the Ripper in some way? We do know that he was very fascinated with true crime, dark crimes, killers, and things like that throughout history. And he was an avid reader. His house did not have a TV in it. It probably didn't have a functioning radio. We know that he listened to mostly talk radio when he was driving. And this is back in the 50s, so there wasn't a whole lot of radio stations, you know, to begin with, but he didn't have a whole lot to occupy his time. He wasn't really capable of running the farm as a farm. He did a lot of odd jobs. Strangely enough, he was a local babysitter, and he was one of like a favorite local babysitter because he was very dependable. Got along with all the kids. Yeah, some of the older kids thought he was kind of strange, mostly because he told them about his shrunken head collection, and showed them to a teenager, actually, like, hey, check out my cool shrunken heads, the way that you or I would have shown a friend, like, hey, let's check out my video game collection, or look at my cool Matchbox cards, or my baseball cards. He was, hey, check out my shrunken heads. He pinned faces to the walls, things like that. Like Ed collected as he went along, kind of. One of the biggest things that kind of disturbed me was that there was a potential linked case to Ed Gein. Maybe, maybe not. It was close by. It was a young girl who disappeared. I'll touch on it a little bit more later. But the circumstances were very, very similar. And to hear that he was actually a person of interest in this case, again, it was after the fact that he was arrested and they discovered his house of horrors. But still, he was implicated enough for investigators to say, maybe. But Ed would never admit to anything like that. Ed would never admit to ever harming a child. He was offended by the fact that people thought that he may have harmed children. So that kind of makes it hard to tie him to it. But at the same time, you know, it's one of those maybe, maybe not kind of situations. So who knows? Getting into a case that is definite by Ed's own admission and by evidence found on the Gein farm. We're going to start with Ed's first murder victim, Mary Hogan. Now, I've read a few different accounts about Mary Hogan, what kind of person she was, who she was. And to me, I've watched a couple of the Gein movies, I've watched the documentaries, and she's just often depicted as a woman that Ed's mother would have absolutely despised because of the way that she acted and the way that she behaved. Now, Mary Hogan owned a tavern in what is actually Pine Grove, Wisconsin. She was a German immigrant, came to Portage County in 1949. She'd been married twice. However, at the time of her passing, she was a single lady. In 1954, she was 54 years old, and that was also the last time that she was seen alive. It was not immediately suspected that Ed was responsible for her disappearance because her case went cold very, very quickly. There wasn't any witnesses, nothing like that. They found blood. They found a spent shell casing. But there wasn't any witnesses as to who could have been involved. The incident occurred on December 8th. The timeline for this is actually pretty tight. They know that it happened sometime between 4:30 and 5:30 p.m. on December 8th. That's a pretty tight window. So for that kind of a timeline, for nobody to have witnessed anything or seen anything, it may sound kind of astonishing. However, you have to consider where we were, rural Wisconsin in the 50s, so even more rural than it is now. Growing up in that area, I can tell you, you can travel miles before seeing houses side by side, before seeing any sign of civilization. When I was a kid, I used to go out into the woods around the smaller towns and just hike, walk, run without ever coming across anything. No semblance of life whatsoever, just forest, you know? So it's really not that far-fetched to believe that nobody saw anything. What we do know is that Ed was a frequent patron of Mary's Tavern, so she probably knew him to some degree. More so of, the weird guy in town that for some reason people still let babysit their children. She probably knew him, and she probably was comfortable with him and trusted him. He seemed like he was a frail older man, completely harmless. Anyone who's ever talked about Ed Gein has always said, like, yeah, he was a little weird, but I always thought he was harmless. And for the most part, he was, until Augusta passed, and then a whole other side of Ed came out. So it wasn't until 1957, when Ed was arrested, that they would find Mary's remains. And what they did find was her skull was in a box, and then her face was inside of a paper bag, which was preserved into like some kind of a mask. So because of that, they couldn't immediately identify her face right away, just because of the way that it was. But when they questioned Ed about what had been found, he did admit to killing Mary Hogan by shooting her in the head. So, with Mary Hogan, it's a little bit different than his second victim, Bernice Worden, which we're going to get into here shortly, which is far more grotesque. But though he did admit to the murder, he denied memory of any kind of detail in specifics with her death. It was just, yes, I did. I mean, obviously, he did. They found her head and her face. Why he killed her? There's a lot of different theories. Some of them are that, she had loose morals and Augusta wouldn't have approved, and Ed saw her as evil and that she didn't belong in this world with him because she was wicked or sinful or whatever Augusta would have said that would have been deeply, deeply burned into Ed's mind. So there's that theory. Or there's another theory that Mary was around that age. She was older. And it may have been someone that just reminded him of Augusta. Now, again, he was unable to retrieve her body from the cemetery after she passed. So this could have been his way of trying to get Mother to come home in a different form. Yeah, who knows what he was thinking at that time. His second victim, however, Bernice Worden, that was a different situation. There were a lot of evidence pieces that pointed to Ed. There was some witnesses to the act of removing her from where she was murdered. And it's something that a lot of people that have studied this case can't really figure out how nobody could specifically and confidently say, yes, it was Ed Gein that I saw moving Bernice Worden out of the back of the store. We'll do a quick recap on the case details here. It was actually early in the morning, November 16th of 1957. If you are from the Midwest, you know that that time of year, the towns are relatively quiet, especially in 1957. Everybody was out deer hunting. So wives and girlfriends stayed home, husbands and boyfriends were out in the woods, and that's just how it was, especially in that part of the state, which is pretty primo deer hunting, actually. But on that particular day in 1957, Bernice Worden, owner of Worden Hardware and Implements, vanished from her hardware store sometime in the morning. Now, again, nobody was in town. The last known timeline that we can really pinpoint is somebody did see the hardware store's truck driving out from the rear of the building shortly after 9:30 a.m. So sometime around 9:30 a.m., somebody saw Worden's hardware truck leaving the back side of the building. Throughout the day, the store didn't really see a whole lot of customers. Some of the area residents, drove by, saw that the store was dark, and just assumed she had closed up due to the deer hunting season. That's what they would have assumed. Now, the interesting thing about the Bernice Worden case is that her son, Frank, was actually a deputy sheriff with Waushara County. He actually came in to check on his mother. He came into the store around 5 o'clock, and he found the cash register was open. There was a trail of blood and some blood staining on the floor. And he immediately, suspected the worst. Being that he was a police officer, he knew that the evening before, Ed Gein had been in the store, and he was going to be coming back for a gallon of antifreeze. He needed a whole gallon of it. There was a sales slip for the antifreeze, which was actually the last written receipt by Bernice Worden, and it was from the morning that she disappeared. So immediately that pointed to Ed Gein. And this was ultimately Ed's immediate downfall. There was no lengthy interrogation or investigation. Ed was a little tough to crack at first, but after he started to spill some of the details, he let them go relatively quick. What exactly happened between Ed and Bernice in the store that morning, we'll never know. A lot of people believe that he had convinced her to let him look at a rifle, which he loaded a round into. And then he used that kind of as a way for her to feel comfortable while he loaded a weapon in front of her that he was going to use to shoot her. It was a .22 caliber rifle. And then anything else that happened to her happened following her death. She did die either immediately in the hardware store there or shortly after en route to the Gein farm. So that evening, On November 16th, 1957, they immediately suspected Ed Gein. He was arrested at the West Plainfield grocery store. So he was out grocery shopping after he had murdered someone and driven their body back to his house. He decided he needed to pick up some groceries. And they took him to the Gein farm where the sheriff's department began to search. Now, this is where it gets downright disturbing. Police officers from that time frame, the ones who were in that group that first walked through the Gein family home, they have admitted to having lifelong trauma because of it, because of what they saw in the house. Unfortunately, there was an officer who went into, I don't remember if it was the barn or if it was just a shed that was on the property. However, the way that they found Bernice Warden's body, she was hung upside down. Her head had been removed, and she was dressed out like a deer. She was hanging from her ankles, completely gutted, dressed out like a deer. So, an absolutely horrible scene for an officer to walk in on. I can only imagine that Frank, being a sheriff's deputy, was on the scene as well. So he had to see his mother like that, and that's just horrible. Whether you get along with your mother or not, I could never imagine seeing that or going through that. That would have been just absolutely terrible. So those are the only two confirmed killings that we have from Ed Gein, are Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden. Now, again, Henry is another potential suspect. There was even some speculation that Ed had suffocated his mother near her final days because she became too much to care for. And as her health declined, so did her mental state, and she may have been lashing out at Ed or, making him feel inferior, and he just didn't like it. Once they got into the house, sheriff's deputies found a multitude of items that you would never ever expect to find. Among the items found in the farmhouse were whole human bones and bone fragments. There was a trash can made of human skin, like a small wastebasket made of human skin. Human skin covering several of the chairs throughout the home. Human skulls mounted on bedposts. Some of the skulls had the top sawn off them. There was bowls made from human skulls that he had admitted to eating out of. Leggings that were made from human leg skin, along with a corset made from a female torso that was skinned from shoulders to waist. There was masks that were made from the skin of some of the female victims that he had, we'll just say, violated post-mortem. The Mary Hogan evidence, Bernice Warden's head in a burlap sack, and then her heart. It was determined to be her heart. There were 9 parts of female anatomy. That's as deep as I'm going into that one. In a shoebox. A young girl's dress with, again, 2 pieces of female anatomy that had been judged to be roughly 15 years old. A belt made from human nipples, 4 noses, a pair of lips on a window shade drawing, and a lampshade made from the face of one of his post-mortem victims. Now, the most fascinating thing to me, and disturbing, I'm going to go with disturbing, was the woman's suit. So Gein admitted that shortly after his mother's death, so shortly after Augusta had passed, he had began creating a woman's suit so that he could become his mother to literally crawl into her skin. While there was no necrophilia, by Ed's own admission, from the bodies that he exhumed, and his reasoning was because they smelled too bad, there seemed to be a lot of focus on certain parts of the bodies. So while Gein only admitted to taking items from 9 different graves, he did say during an interview that he had made up to 40 nighttime visits to cemeteries locally. Um, and when he describes how he felt or what he was thinking when he was doing this, he's very vague about it, and he gives very little detail other than it felt like he was in some kind of a daze, like he wasn't in his own mind while he was doing this. And while he made 40 trips, he said roughly 30 of those times he would come out of the daze, in the cemetery, or while digging up a grave, and he would just leave. He would return the grave as it was before he started to dig, and then he would just go home empty handed. On the other occasions, he did dig up the graves of recently buried middle aged women that he thought resembled his mother, and he would take the bodies home or take parts of the bodies home with him. And then he would do what he would do, whatever it was he was looking to do at that time. By no means would I agree that Ed Gein was so insane that he didn't realize what he was doing at any point in time. I think that the objection comes from the morality of it, and I think that a lot of that stems from his childhood and growing up with Augusta, and a lot of the teachings that to an underdeveloped child mind could have been misinterpreted or could have been taken the wrong way or taken out of context even. And there's no way for him to decipher that as he gets older, because there's nobody there that tells him what's right and wrong. And anything that his brother Henry told him, he suspected was just, not true. At some point, there was a 16-year-old that was in his home, and it was from, one of the kids from the neighborhood that he knew as a babysitter. And that's the kid that he told his parents that Ed Gein had shown him the shrunken heads. Later on, these shrunken heads were determined to be actual human face masks that he had collected during his time. During questioning, the sheriff, obviously this was a very emotional case for the sheriff's department, given that one of their deputies' mothers was a victim, and the way that she was found, and then the way that they had discovered all of the other items in the home. The sheriff at the time, his name was Art, everybody says reportedly, allegedly, suspectedly, assaulted Gein by banging his head and his face into a brick wall. And that's why his initial confession was ruled inadmissible. But really, he knew what he had found in Gein's house. He knew that Gein was the only one that resided in that home. He knew without a shadow of a doubt, before the days of DNA, like this was as close as you could get to having DNA evidence that says this person definitely did this. To walk into their house that they reside in and finding all these things. So he was a little unhinged trying to get the confession. And then unfortunately, the sheriff passed away from heart failure in 1968, before Gein actually was able to go to trial. He was only 43 years old. Everybody around him that knew him said that he was deeply traumatized by the horror that he saw in the house, and just having to catalog and assemble the case against Ed Gein and the crimes that he had committed. And then there was the fear of having to testify in court about the alleged assault that most definitely happened during that initial interrogation in Ed Gein's holding cell, where he pummeled him, just trying to get him to admit that he did it. But everyone around him thinks that those were contributing factors to his death. He was a very stressed individual, deeply traumatized individual, and it may have spelled his demise prior to Ed Gein's trial, which I can only imagine had he been around for that and seen it through the end, knowing that Ed Gein would never spend a day in prison. It probably would have been very, very difficult for him to absorb. All right. Now we're going to talk about the crimes that Gein was thought to have been involved in, but they could never really prove anything. Approximately 3:30 p.m. on May 1st in 1947, a Georgia Jean Weckler was given a ride home from school in Jefferson by a neighbor. Her home is in Fort Adkins, Wisconsin. She was dropped off where Highway 12 meets the road that led to the Weckler farm. And she was last seen when she paused to open the family mailbox, removed some mail, and then witnesses saw a 1936 Ford sedan, black in color, with a gray plastic spotlight in that area that afternoon, matched the description of Ed Gein's car. So that was a possibility. Evelyn Grace Hartley went missing while babysitting a 20-month-old at the home of a La Crosse State College professor on the evening of October 4th, 1953. That evening, her father, Richard, called the residence several times after she failed to check in as planned at 8:30. He didn't receive an answer. Being that he was concerned, he drove home. They lived in Rasmussen, Wisconsin. And they found that the doors were locked, the lights and the radio were on, there was items scattered all over the house, the living room furniture had been moved around to different places, as were Evelyn's school books. Richard found her shoes in different rooms. One shoe was upstairs, one shoe was downstairs. And he found his daughter's broken glasses upstairs as well. However, he did not find Evelyn in the house. So after the arrest, Ed Gein was questioned regarding Hartley's disappearance, but he denied involvement and passed a couple lie detector tests. So, but again, if you know anything about psychology and how a lie detector tests work, if the person who's committing the crime didn't genuinely believe that it was a crime, it doesn't register on a lie detector test. For example, on a true sociopath, a lie detector test is useless. Police found no trace of the girl's remains during a search of Ed Gein's property. You know, again, this one to me doesn't really sound like Ed. I mean, tossing furniture around and things like that. It just doesn't. He wouldn't have done all that if you look at his other crimes. All right, moving on to November 1st of 1952. Victor Harold Travis, a resident of Adams County, went off to deer hunt along with his friend Raymond Burgess. In the late afternoon, the pair stopped for refreshments at Mac's Bar in Plainfield. They were there for quite a few hours. At around 7 o'clock, they both left the bar, got into Raymond's car, and then drove away. The hunters, along with the car that Raymond was driving, were never seen again. There was no trace of them that was ever found. They had been hunting on the property next to Ed Gein's farm, despite his objections to them hunting on the day of their disappearance. So they were hunting there. He didn't want them hunting there. It's a loose tie-in, but maybe, especially if he happened to be down at the bar, or if he was in Plainfield and saw their car. Who knows? He's also been reportedly, possibly linked to a disappearance from June of 1954. James Walsh. Walsh and his wife lived pretty close to the Gein farm. Gein had performed chores for Mrs. Walsh after her husband went missing. Again, that case remains open, and Ed Gein denied all association with it. All right, so there are probably a few others that have come like coincidentally Um, like, okay, maybe he was involved, but probably not. So let's get to the trial. The trial was interesting because he was arraigned on November 21st of 1957 with only one count of first-degree murder in Washera County. He pleaded non-guilty by reason of insanity. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, he was found mentally incompetent, and therefore he was unfit for trial. Gein was then sent to Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, which is now known as Dodge Correctional Institution. It's a maximum security facility. It's in Waupun, Wisconsin. It's as Dodge Correctional. It's known for some other pretty infamous inmates. Those will come up in later episodes. And then from there, he was transferred to Mendota Mental Health Institute, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, the capital city. While he was in Mendota, he was, for the most part, a model patient. This was years and years and years ago. I worked at a youth corrections facility, and our intake list ranged from conduct disorder through, psychological, mental disorders, impairments, things like that. And one of the employees there, and I'm not going to say his name just because I don't want to put that out there, but he was one of the orderlies that worked at Mendota for a very long time, and it was actually during this time that Ed Gein was there for part of it. And he said he was very polite, quiet, didn't really talk to a lot of people, kind of focused on arts and crafts quite a bit. Oddly enough, one of the things that he really enjoyed working on was leather work. And this particular coworker of mine actually had a wallet, an older leather wallet that was stamped EG. And he said he would, Ed would stamp all of his items EG. So, he told me that from an adult's perspective, it didn't seem like Ed was so much childlike as he was just complacent. And again, that could have been from medications that he was on at that time, but he wasn't really all there all the time. And he would repeat things quite a bit. We know that he passed away in Mendota Health Facility in 1968. There were some doctors that determined that Gein was mentally able to discuss his case with counsel and participate in his own defense, which led to a trial that started on November 7th of 1968. It only lasted a week. The psychiatrist testified that Gein had told him that he did not know whether the killing of Warden was something he did on purpose or if it was an accident. He couldn't give any details to it. Again, it was very similar to the explanation of when he would go out grave robbing, and he would just say that, I was kind of in a daze, or I don't really recall any detail as to what I was thinking or what I was doing at that time. What Ed had claimed, what he had divulged to his attorney at that time, was that he aimed the rifle, or that he had not aimed the rifle at Warden, and he didn't remember anything else that happened from the morning previously. Like, he didn't remember, like, thinking to himself, like, okay, I'm gonna go down to Warden's Hardware and I'm gonna shoot Bernice Warden. So he doesn't even remember loading the round into the gun. Okay, so with that being said, in a new trial, okay, so this is where he hasn't been deemed mentally competent to stand trial, so don't get the two confused. At the request of the defense, so Gein's lawyers, they asked him that he be held without a jury trial. So Judge Gulmer at the time found Gein guilty, and there was going to be another trial after that would be held to determine whether or not Ed Gein was sane or insane. Either way, after testimonies by doctors for both the prosecution and defense, the judge ruled that Gein was not guilty by reason of insanity. And he was ordered to be committed to Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where he spent the rest of his life. part of it in what is now Dodge Correctional and part of it in Mendota Mental Health Institute. He was only tried for the one murder, though he did admit to killing Mary Hogan throughout this process. So that's kind of what happened throughout the trial. It was very short. Clearly, if you listen to any of the interview tapes that are out there now of Ed, when he's describing what he did, or when he's being questioned about what he did, he really doesn't seem to recall a whole lot of detail. His story doesn't change. And it's something that can be said for the gaps in his memory. And again, you have to remember, like, his father beat him mercilessly, and then on top of that, during the initial interrogation, the sheriff did as well, including banging his head off of a cinder block wall repeatedly. Ed stayed in Mendota Mental Health Institute for the rest of his life. He did end up succumbing to lung cancer, July 26th of 1984. He was 77 years old. His official cause of death was actually respiratory failure, but that was what they believe was caused by lung cancer. Again, there is no grave marker. I believe the last time there was a grave marker where Ed is actually buried in Plainfield Cemetery was pre-2000. So like 98 or 99 was when they finally removed the last graffitied headstone. And it's in the Waushara County Sheriff's Station somewhere. I would imagine down in the basement, along with quite a few of the other items that were taken from the Gein house. Some of it was respectfully destroyed, I guess I will say, because, obvious reasons. After Ed Gein was arrested, they were actually trying to hold an auction at the Ed Gein home, and there was some things that survived, but oddly enough, on the morning of March 20th, the house was burned to the ground. And the deputy fire marshal had said that there was a garbage fire or something. They were burning stuff that came out of the house that couldn't be sold. He said that it was 75 feet away from the house. And they had hired a cleaning crew. And that some of the hot coals that were recovered from the spot of the bonfire had been used to set the house on fire. Arson is heavily suspected, but the cause of the fire was never officially determined. Obviously, back in the late 1950s, we didn't have a lot of the technology that we have now today to find trace elements of like chemicals or things like that. So there wasn't a whole lot left after it burned. There was some items that survived. Obviously, there are some things that just don't burn. I know one of the things that has more recently come into an auction for sale was somebody had a cauldron from the Ed Gein property that they said they were told by a family member, which obviously this probably isn't true, but that he used to boil human remains when he was practicing cannibalism, and a shovel. And those both sold to I guess we're going to go with popular paranormal investigator, Zach Bagans. And he did an episode of some TV show about it. And then he's got a museum or something. Or he had a museum. I don't know. I've heard a lot of things about it getting shut down because of unlawfully obtained human remains. I don't know. I got nothing against Zach. I don't know the guy personally, but you just hear what you hear. The other big thing that came out of that auction was Ed's car. So Ed's Ford sedan was sold for $760, which by today's standards would be about $9,000, to a carnival sideshow owner named Bunny Gibbons. And he would charge people 25 cents to see it. Where the car is now, who knows? I haven't seen it or really dug in that deep to find out where it is right now. But all I know is that it is gone. Or maybe somebody else bought it. I don't know. All right. So that's the case of Ed Gein. It's more direct, to the point, factual. I will say that while I'm sure that the Netflix Monster series was an entertaining show, I didn't actually finish watching it because I only got a few episodes in and realized that it was complete fabrication. At least 90% of it was just not at all true. From the Ed Gein case, at the time that it happened, it was something in the media that became a spectacle. And it inspired so many fictional characters, from Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Hannibal Lecter, to a certain degree. So there's a lot of things that came out of this, and it's a case that'll definitely echo throughout the streets of Plainfield for as long as it exists. You still have people that'll come, like I said earlier, they will come and they will collect pieces of sand and dirt from the Ed Gein gravesite. That's one of the big reasons why they had to remove the headstone, was because people were coming and chiseling off pieces of it to take with them. So they just found it better to remove it. If you do go to the cemetery in Plainfield, Wisconsin, please be respectful. A lot of people's family members are buried there. So even when I visit cemeteries, whether it's for family members of myself or just to tour the cemetery, I'm always very respectful. I ask that you do the same, especially in this case, because the town of Plainfield is really just trying to, not really pretend that this didn't happen, but not make it the reason why people come to Plainfield, because it is a lot of times. All right, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you enjoyed the artwork. Again, the piece that I chose to do with the Ed Gein episode is called Duality, just because I think, despite his monstrous crimes and actions, Ed did have a softer side. He never harmed any of the children that he babysat for. He was always willing to help people, jump right in and help with, farm chores or whatever else needed to be done. So I think the duality fits into that pretty well. That good and evil, which, creates balance. In this case, Ed was very unbalanced. And that's going to be it. I look forward to seeing you at our next episode and my next piece of art.